Two powerful regional forces that should be fighting shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy are instead pointing diplomatic daggers at each other, creating a fatal blind spot that only armed insurgents will exploit. In a region where every single bullet fired and every border breached carries the weight of national survival, the most alarming development in West Africa right now is not a new offensive by extremist groups. It is a massive, unprecedented diplomatic crisis tearing right through the heart of the continent. The political architecture of West Africa is fracturing, and the epicenter of this earthquake is a fierce standoff between the traditional heavyweight, Nigeria, and the newly solidified Alliance of Sahel States. What started as a political speech in Abuja has rapidly escalated into a geopolitical showdown, exposing a dangerous game of scapegoating and proving that the nations of the Sahel are no longer willing to be the punching bags for their neighbors' internal failures. The spark that ignited this diplomatic firestorm was struck on July 30th. Inside the presidential villa in Abuja, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu was addressing traditional rulers about the ongoing devastating security operations within his own country. But instead of looking inward at the systemic issues plaguing Nigeria, the president pointed his finger directly at the Sahel. He made an explosive claim, stating that the insecurity ravaging Nigeria is being fueled and exacerbated by the crisis in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. He painted a picture of thousands of non-Nigerian armed actors crossing the borders, essentially arguing that the catastrophic violence tearing through Nigerian communities is a problem imported from the Alliance of Sahel States. By making this statement, the highest office in Nigeria effectively adopted the exact same narrative that has been meticulously engineered in European parliaments and echoed by the African Union. It is a narrative designed to frame the Sahel Confederation as a failed, destabilizing force that poses a danger to the entire region. For a long time, neighboring countries and foreign powers alike have used this rhetoric with impunity, assuming the sanctioned, transitional governments of the Sahel would simply absorb the criticism in silence. They were wrong. Exactly 7 days later, the Alliance of Sahel States struck back. The response did not come in the form of an angry midnight social media post or a rushed press release. The 7 days of silence were not a sign of weakness. They were a period of calculated, strategic consultation. On the evening of August 6th, the foreign minister of Burkina Faso, Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré, summoned Nigeria's chargé d'affaires in Ouagadougou. But this was no ordinary diplomatic dressing down. When the Nigerian envoy walked into that room, he did not just face Burkina Faso. Flanking the Burkinabe foreign minister were the diplomatic representatives of both Mali and Niger. This was a historic display of unity. They were not speaking as three isolated nations struggling under the weight of foreign sanctions. They were operating as a single sovereign confederation, staring down the envoy of West Africa's most populous nation and delivering a unified rebuke. The message they delivered was sharp, unwavering, and profoundly significant. The Alliance of Sahel States described President Tinubu's analysis as hasty, overly simplistic, and completely surprising. They made it absolutely clear that such comments deeply disrespected the heavy sacrifices being made by the defense and security forces of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. These are soldiers who are paying the ultimate price in the sand and the heat, fighting a complex war against highly mobile armed groups. To have their struggle reduced to a convenient excuse for Nigeria's own security failures was a red line the AES was not going to let anyone cross. Yet, even in the middle of this diplomatic strike, the AES maintained a level of political maturity that completely dismantled the narrative of them being rogue, uncooperative states. They did not sever diplomatic ties. They did not close their doors. Instead, they reminded the Nigerian envoy that all four countries are facing the exact same enemy. They emphasized that every military success achieved by the AES forces inherently protects the entire sub-region, including Nigeria. They laid down a challenge, stating they would have preferred a factual, honest presentation of the security situation rather than watching a neighboring president place the blame for a deeply complex, decades-old crisis squarely on their shoulders. This coordinated diplomatic maneuver proves something the rest of the world is struggling to accept. The Alliance of Sahel States is acting like a real, formidable diplomatic power. They are moving as a state, unified in purpose and fiercely protective of their sovereignty, refusing to be sacrificed on the altar of another nation's political convenience. To understand why this diplomatic counterstrike by the Alliance of Sahel States was so devastatingly effective, we have to look past the political rhetoric and examine the cold, hard calendar of historical facts. When a sitting president claims that neighboring nations are adding fuel to his country's internal fire, the most logical response is to track exactly when that fire was ignited. And the moment you align the timeline of West African security, the narrative completely collapses. The foundations of Nigeria's devastating security crisis were not imported from the Sahel. They were not manufactured in Ouagadougou, Bamako, or Niamey. They were entirely homegrown, cultivated in Nigerian soil long before the Alliance of Sahel States was even a concept. Let us rewind the clock to July of 2009. The city of Maiduguri in northeastern Nigeria suddenly erupted into extreme violence, marking the first major armed uprising of the group the world would come to know as Boko Haram. Police stations were overrun. Hundreds of people were killed in a matter of days, and the very fabric of Nigerian national security was permanently altered. At that exact moment in 2009, Muammar Gaddafi was still firmly in power in Libya. The NATO bombing campaign that would eventually shatter the Libyan state and flood the Sahel with heavy weaponry was still 2 years away. The horrific war in Mali that began in 2012 had not yet started. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was just a teenager. The sovereign confederation we now call the AES was more than a decade away from existence. Yet, Nigeria was already locked in a deadly war with an insurgency created, funded, and tolerated entirely within its own borders. From that initial explosion of violence, the crisis metastasized into a multifaceted nightmare, none of which can be honestly blamed on the Sahel. The insurgency in the northeast fractured, giving birth to lethal offshoots around the Lake Chad basin. The northwest of Nigeria was swallowed by heavily armed banditry, transforming mass school kidnappings into a highly organized, multi-million-dollar illicit industry. The Middle Belt continues to be drenched in the blood of vicious farmer-herder clashes. The Niger Delta has seen decades of militancy surrounding oil infrastructure. As the United Nations accurately pointed out, the insecurity in Nigeria is no longer localized to one specific region. It is everywhere, Over 40,000 lives have been lost in this relentless wave of violence, with the vast majority of victims being everyday citizens attacked in their homes, their farms, and their places of worship. The sheer scale of this emergency forced the Nigerian government into drastic measures. Just days before the president's controversial speech, Abuja approved the largest restructuring of the Nigerian army in decades, expanding from 8 to 12 divisions and injecting an additional 28,000 troops into the ranks. This massive militarization is a clear admission of a state in profound distress. But rather than acknowledging the systemic internal failures that necessitated such a massive military expansion, the political leadership chose to point fingers outward. This blame game becomes even more glaring when you look at who is allowed to operate freely within Nigeria's borders. While the government points to the Sahel as the source of its troubles, it simultaneously tolerates domestic figures who openly advocate for the very extremists tearing the region apart. Radical clerics who preach division and actively campaign for dialogue with armed terror networks remain influential voices in the country. Some of these domestic figures have even publicly condemned the leadership in Burkina Faso for taking a hardline stance against extremist ideologies. You cannot empower the ideological architects of terror in your own backyard and then claim that a neighboring alliance is responsible for the blood on your streets. So why would the Nigerian leadership choose to antagonize its neighbors with such a fragile historical argument? The answer is rooted in political survival. Nigeria is slowly marching toward a highly contested election season in 2027. For the average Nigerian voter, the crushing weight of insecurity is the single most critical issue on the ballot. The government's record is under intense fire from opposition, parties, traditional rulers, and ordinary citizens who are exhausted from burying their dead. When domestic pressure reaches a boiling point, blame becomes the cheapest political currency available. By shifting the responsibility for the violence onto the Alliance of Sahel States, politicians in Abuja can offer their desperate citizens a convenient scapegoat. The people you blame across the border do not vote in your elections. Even more strategically, repeating the narrative that the Sahel is destabilizing the region aligns perfectly with the talking points of the European Union and the African Union. It buys goodwill from foreign capitals that are desperate to see the AES isolated. But as the historic summons in Burkina Faso proved, the AES is fully aware of this political theater, and they absolutely refuse to play the role of the villain in someone else's election campaign. To truly understand the catastrophic cost of this diplomatic theater, we must pull ourselves out of the air-conditioned staterooms of Abuja and the pristine ministerial offices in Ouagadougou. We have to travel to the very edge of the map, down to the sprawling, sun-baked stretch of earth that separates northern Nigeria from southern Niger. This is a massive expanse, a 1,600-kilometer frontier of red dust and scrubland. On paper, it is a border. In reality, it is a single breathing ecosystem where families, commerce, and ancient histories bleed seamlessly across an invisible line drawn by European cartographers over a century ago. Here, the political blame game dominating the headlines is not just a frustrating news cycle. It is a matter of life and death. Imagine a community sitting right on this dividing line. For generations, the people here have not defined themselves strictly as Nigerian or Nigerian. They are farmers, herders, and traders whose daily survival depends on the free flow of goods and goodwill across the dirt roads. A merchant might buy grain in a Nigerian market at dawn and sell it in a Nigerian village by dusk. To them, the geopolitical identity of the soil beneath their feet is mostly irrelevant. But when the diplomatic ties between their respective capitals begin to sever, the shock wave hits this dust-choked border town with devastating force. When a sitting president in Abuja publicly blames the Sahel for his nation's insecurity, and when the Alliance of Sahel States retaliates by officially summoning envoys, the fallout trickles down immediately to the men carrying rifles on the front lines. The military checkpoints dotting this vast frontier suddenly change their posture. Where there was once a fragile but necessary communication between Nigerian border guards and Nigerian patrols, there is now a deafening silence. The regional radios go quiet. Joint intelligence sharing evaporates. The multinational task forces that were designed to operate cohesively across these borders become paralyzed by political mistrust. Two armies that share the exact same enemy suddenly stop looking across the border for allies and instead begin looking across the border with deep suspicion. This diplomatic pride creates a massive, gaping blind spot, and the armed insurgents know exactly how to exploit it. Terrorist networks do not respect sovereignty, and they certainly do not care about diplomatic summonses to a highly mobile, heavily armed militant group. A border where two neighboring militaries refuse to speak to one another is not a barrier. It is a 4-lane highway. Because there is no functional joint operational framework to coordinate a cross-border pursuit, insurgents can launch a brutal midnight raid on a Nigerian village, burn the homes, take hostages, and simply slip a few miles north into Nigerian territory. The Nigerian forces stop at the invisible line, handcuffed by sovereignty disputes and political tension, while the Nigerian forces are left unaware or structurally unable to coordinate a trap on the other side. The militants vanish into the night, entirely untouched, protected by the political egos of the men in the capital cities. When the sun rises, it is the ordinary villagers who are left to sift through the ashes of their lives. They are the ones forced to bury their neighbors in the hard earth. They do not care about who won the argument at the African Union. They do not care about the eloquent rebuttals delivered by foreign ministers or the political maneuvers designed to secure votes for the next election cycle in Abuja. All they know is that their leaders have abandoned them to settle political scores. The profound tragedy of this fractured relationship is that the civilian population has been turned into human collateral for a geopolitical dispute. By choosing to point fingers rather than share critical military intelligence, the regional leadership transforms the very people they are sworn to protect into soft targets. The farmers and traders along the border become the ultimate victims of a war that is artificially sustained by division. When leaders focus their energy on crafting the perfect diplomatic rebuke rather than building a unified military front, they are actively choosing to leave their most vulnerable citizens exposed to horrific violence. This micro-level catastrophe is playing out every single day across the vast expanse of West Africa. It is a haunting reminder that while the elite classes use insecurity as a convenient talking point to deflect domestic pressure, the grassroots populations are paying the actual price. The blood spilled in these border communities is the direct, unedited cost of a fractured continent. To maintain the integrity of this analysis, we must firmly anchor ourselves in objective reality. The Alliance of Sahel States is not immune to criticism, and the borders of West Africa are undeniably porous. It is a verifiable fact that highly equipped, deeply radicalized insurgents do not respect national sovereignty. These armed elements move across the vast arid stretches of the Sahel and the Lake Chad basin with terrifying fluidity, smuggling weapons, illicit funds, and fighters across the 1,600-kilometer border that separates Niger from Nigeria. To deny that violence spills over these invisible lines would be a disservice to the truth. However, acknowledging the reality of a borderless insurgency is entirely different from weaponizing that reality to shift the blame for a sovereign nation's systemic domestic security failures. The fundamental issue here is not that cross-border movement exists, it is the geopolitical theater being constructed around it. When we elevate our perspective from the regional dust to the global geopolitical chessboard, a much more sinister dynamic reveals itself. The narrative that the Alliance of Sahel States is a chaotic, destabilizing force dragging the rest of West Africa into an abyss is not a new concept. It is a meticulously drafted talking point that was engineered in the legislative halls of the European Union and aggressively promoted by the African Union. For years, Western powers have watched with growing alarm as Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger systematically dismantled neo-colonial security arrangements, expelled foreign military bases, and formed a sovereign defense pact. To the foreign capitals that once treated the Sahel as a permanent military playground, this newfound independence is a terrifying precedent. They desperately need the world to believe that the AES experiment is a catastrophic failure. But there is a glaring problem for the West. When a European diplomat stands on a podium and declares the Sahel a danger to global security, it reeks of neo-colonial bitterness. The narrative lacks local legitimacy. However, when the president of Nigeria, the economic and military heavyweight of the region, stands up and echoes that exact same script, the narrative suddenly gains immense, devastating credibility. Whether intentionally or as a byproduct of domestic political survival, Abuja is providing an African voice to a European script. By publicly accusing the AES of fueling Nigeria's internal crisis, the political establishment is essentially validating the exact pretext that foreign powers need to justify further diplomatic isolation, economic strangulation, or even future intervention in the Sahel. The timing of these events removes any doubt that this is a coordinated diplomatic strategy. Just one single day after the AES historically summoned the Nigerian envoy in Ouagadougou to protest these accusations, the African Union's Peace and Security Council convened a meeting specifically focused on the Sahel. And during that session, the African Union effectively repeated the very same claims, cementing the narrative that the Confederation is a regional hazard. This is no longer just a bilateral misunderstanding. It is a synchronized, high-stakes campaign to paint the Alliance of Sahel States into a diplomatic corner, forcing them to defend their legitimacy on multiple fronts while simultaneously fighting a brutal ground war against terror networks. This environment of toxic suspicion has completely paralyzed the actual physical fight against the insurgents. The institutional trust between the economic community of West African states and the AES has collapsed to dangerous lows. We saw a stark preview of this last December when a Nigerian Air Force transport plane experienced mechanical failure and made an emergency landing in Burkina Faso. What should have been a routine aviation incident between neighbors immediately escalated into a tense sovereignty dispute, with local forces placed on high alert. Although diplomatic back channels eventually resolved the standoff, the incident exposed just how razor-thin the line between regional cooperation and outright hostility has become. Today, there is absolutely no comprehensive joint operational framework between the military command in Abuja and the defense ministries in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey. The old multinational task forces are politically comatose. Both sides are bleeding. Both sides are fighting the exact same heavily armed extremist factions across the exact same geography. Yet, they refuse to integrate their intelligence or coordinate their strikes. We must ask ourselves who actually benefits from a West Africa so deeply fractured that its armies will not speak to each other. It is certainly not the citizens burying their dead. The ultimate beneficiaries are the armed groups who thrive in the ungoverned, uncoordinated spaces left behind by political gridlock. And sitting comfortably above the fray are the foreign geopolitical architects who know perfectly well that a divided, suspicious, and blaming West Africa is a West Africa that remains perpetually dependent on outside intervention to survive. The ultimate countermeasure to this grand geopolitical manipulation is exactly what the Alliance of Sahel States demonstrated in Ouagadougou, though perhaps not in the way foreign capitals expected. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger stood together to confront the Nigerian envoy, they were not declaring a new conflict. They were drawing a definitive line in the sand against the politics of division. They were stating unequivocally that the era of treating the Sahel as a political dumping ground for regional failures is absolutely over. This diplomatic strike back was not an act of aggression. It was a demand for regional accountability and a desperate plea for a reality check. For West Africa to survive this multi-front security emergency, the traditional heavyweights of the region must abandon the cheap comfort of scapegoating. Blaming a newly formed confederation for a domestic insurgency that erupted over a decade before the AES even existed is a strategy that guarantees mutual destruction. The path to regional stability does not run through presidential press conferences where neighboring states are thrown under the bus to appease domestic voters or to satisfy European observers. True security requires the harsh, unglamorous work of looking inward. It demands a complete overhaul of domestic political failures, the severing of internal financial networks that sustain armed factions, and the political courage to prosecute the domestic figures who openly advocate for radical ideologies within their own borders. Once that internal house is in order, the vital next step is reaching across that sprawling 1,600-kilometer frontier, not with a diplomatic accusation, but with a concrete, actionable joint military framework. The armed factions ravaging the region understand perfectly well that a unified African front is their greatest existential threat. Foreign geopolitical interests also understand that a cohesive, self-reliant African security apparatus immediately renders their external military bases and neo-colonial oversight obsolete. The only people who seem to be missing this crucial strategic reality are the political elites who are currently sacrificing long-term regional survival on the altar of short-term diplomatic pride. The Alliance of Sahel States has repeatedly signaled that they are ready and willing to fight this common enemy side by side, but they have also made it profoundly clear that they will not do so while being undermined and publicly vilified by the very neighbors they are fighting to protect. The struggle for true sovereignty and stability in West Africa is no longer just playing out in the arid combat zones. It is being aggressively waged in the theater of global public perception. The narratives designed to divide the continent are powerful, heavily funded, and continuously broadcast from Western capitals directly into African institutions. If you believe that our collective survival depends on categorically rejecting these manipulative scripts, and if you refuse to let the continent be fractured by artificial diplomatic crises engineered to keep us weak, then you belong right here with this community. We are building a global space dedicated to stripping away the political theater and analyzing the hard, unapologetic realities of our geopolitical landscape. Subscribe to the channel. Stand with a movement that prioritizes objective truth over political convenience, and help us ensure that the future narrative of our continent is defined by us and never again written for us. The road ahead for the region is deeply complex, and the diplomatic bridges that have been strained will take immense political maturity to rebuild. But acknowledging the honest, historical truth of where these crises actually originated is the only viable starting point for a genuine alliance. Thank you for joining this vital conversation and demanding a higher standard of analysis. Stay vigilant, stay united, and I will see you in the next analysis.